So we're going to talk briefly about, again, how strategic planning process and portfolio planning processes diverge. We're going to talk about the intake process, selection, and then project monitoring and controlling and how that feeds into your planning process, because a lot of times what happens with organizations is you kick off a boatload of projects. It's somewhat like that air traffic controller. You get your planes into the air, and then for a variety of reasons things start to shift, and it's somewhat ironic that project control boards or change control boards will start to see an uptick of change requests during this time of year, particularly if they've got projects that are slated to close in the next 4 to 6 months, and all of a sudden people are starting to ask for more time, they're starting to ask for more money and so forth. And how do you keep those changes flowing into your planning process without bringing everything to its knees? So a little bit of background on what planning does to organizations. And so these metrics were pulled from the Hackett Group. It says that the typical annual planning process for an organization consumes approximately 95 days and has multiple iterations. So that's basically 3 calendar months. And that's what takes you to drive to a budget. They came up with that the average cost of the planning cycle costs about $60,000 for every $100 million in revenue. So it's a pretty costly little adventure. Budget line items average about 230 per a budget, and the goal is to try to trim those down into more manageable buckets. Yes, you're going to get down to very discrete line items, but from an annual budgeting perspective, from a best practice, you want to kind of get away from counting paper clips and envelopes and start looking at things in a more aggregated fashion. And then forecasting cycles. So if you think about if your company goes through reforecasting cycles, typically those activities average about 21 days. And so if you think about the 95 days that you would take for an annual planning process, plus let's say that you do 3 reforecasting processes over the year because maybe you give people a break when you're going in your annual planning process, you're basically using up 158 working days a year just on those types of financial activities. And you vet that out against the 200 and some working days you have a year after you take out calendar or vacations and so forth. It's a big chunk of an organization's time. And if you're a portfolio manager, a lot of what you do spans these various activities. A lot of what you're relied on from an organizational perspective is being able to, somewhat at a moment's notice, talk about, where the line is in your portfolio, how much have you spent year to date, what does your forecast look like, et cetera. And keeping on top of those numbers is almost the bane of a portfolio manager's existence. So how strategic planning, annual planning, and portfolio management all kind of weld together. So if you think about your strategic planning process, typically somewhere at a C-level, the CEO along with his or her direct reports will come up with a vision and a mission and hopefully come up with a way to communicate that to the staff so that everybody understands the general marching orders and where the organization's heading. A lot of organizations then from there build out a 3 to 5 year business and technology outlook, and that looks at the core capabilities that you want to start to deliver from a business perspective and what technology enablement do you need to drive those core capabilities. Part of strategic planning, and this is now where annual planning picks up, is really looking at where are you today. And so if you dovetail back into what you had put in your strategic plan, how far have you chipped away at your strategic plan from the last time that you dusted it off and did an update? What's changed? And what do you want to do from moving forward? And have there been economic factors, market changes, competitive changes, all of those components that might cause an organization to make a fundamental shift? Then from there you get into your annual budget and investment planning. So this is the year-over-year type of activities that an organization is going to partake in to drive that plan. There's a governance process that supports decision making, and so what qualifies a decent project investment that will get prioritized and pulled into the portfolio versus not. And so how are you going to measure those investments? How are you going to enable the team members that are decking those investments up to communicate their best guess on those investments? And then what are you doing from a scorecarding perspective or reporting perspective to provide the information back to the organization that they need to continue to drive decisioning on these topics? Is your portfolio team producing weekly, monthly, or quarterly reports? Do you have a portfolio prioritization committee that includes senior level managers that help drive the selection or even deselection of projects, programs, and other type of work? And so those are all factors that tie into your annual planning process, as well as how you manage your portfolio ongoing. So a little bit of background about the financial planning cycle. So while as a portfolio manager you would like to think that you are the guy or the gal in charge, there's also other stuff that gets pulled into planning. And so there's the strategic component, which as a portfolio manager you have a big part in. There's an operational plan, which you may not have as large of a piece of, but there may be projects that come out of the operational planning process. And even though they may not be strategic in nature, you still may be driving operational improvements. There's also just the base operational plan. So that deals with how you run your business, how you run your IT shop, how you run your marketing shop, and what do you need to pay salaries, turn on electricity, give people chairs and desks to sit in, give them phones, etc. And then there's the capital planning process. And the capital planning process has components from the strategic and operational plan, and it basically talks about what's the true plumbing that you need to keep things afloat. Some organizations do get a little creative when it comes to capital dollars. In a previous life, we used to think of capital spending as somewhat the credit card, and there are a variety of different things that you can do from a capitalization perspective that will impact how cash flow is represented on your statements, and that's where, to the degree that you can pull in somebody from your finance area to basically be your strategic partner, both in the annual financial planning process as well as the forecasting process, it helps a great deal. You should also have that financial partner with you if you are doing portfolio review meetings with your portfolio selection team. Have them either help you pull together the financials, or if you're pulling the financials together on your own, give them the opportunity to eyeball them and provide any input. They can be a valued resource for you, as well as can help you put the information in such a fashion that various people can consume it if that's something you're not comfortable with. So again, how a portfolio office somewhat fits into all of this, you're going to have a portfolio intake process, hopefully, that's going to drive how you gather the critical data elements to deck up a project. So whether you have a system or you're doing this with templates and then aggregating that data, the end result is the same. You want the ability to capture, we'll call it a proposal, and that proposal needs to basically have in it what is it you're trying to accomplish, how does it align to your organization's strategic plan, what capabilities are you trying to deliver, what business case metrics do you want the people that are submitting the proposal to vet against. Is there a specific timing on this, and are there assumptions and things that are going into why you want to do this initiative that other people need to take into consideration from an approval perspective. And ultimately what you're trying to do from a portfolio management perspective is you really want to increase your organization's capability and ability to successfully drive initiatives. And along with driving those initiatives, you want those initiatives to be solid investment decisions. So I always liken running an organization's portfolio, similar to how you would run your own personal financial portfolio. If you've got, if you're a younger person and thinking about having children, or maybe you have young children, one of the ways you might be thinking about funding the children's education is to start making investments. And so if you know that you've got 16 to 18 years before that child is ready to move on to college, so what kind of investments do you need to make to help offset those expenses when the time comes forward? If you're preparing to go into retirement, or even early before that, and you know that you want to retire at a certain age, and you want to be able to have a certain amount of disposable income. It's the same sort of processes apply personally as they do in running an organization's portfolio. What types of investments do we need to make so that we can drive business decisions and be competitive in the marketplace in the future? So how your programs and projects align strategically: you've got your company strategy that's going to dovetail into a set of goals or objectives that your company wants to achieve. From there, you're going to have certain capabilities that feed into those goals and objectives, and your projects or programs will drive those capabilities. Remember, programs are those items that you typically group a set of projects together that are better managed as a program because they will be more efficient and effective at driving a benefit or a capability versus managing them discretely as a project. You don't necessarily have to have programs in the mix. There are a lot of companies out there that don't do true program management. They manage things like projects, and a lot of that depends on your organizational maturity, how large you are, and how complex things are. So some annual planning best practices and some things to think about as you look to engage in your annual planning process. One size doesn't fit all, and you need to focus on your organizational capabilities versus the expectations. And prior to going into a planning process, whether you're an established PMO leader or maybe you're new to the organization, it's important to kind of get a lay of the land with the various stakeholders that play in the planning process. So again, if you've got a centralized group that's responsible for approving the portfolio, get a sense or revisit with them, what types of data points and contextual information do they need to help drive a portfolio selection decision. From a budgeting perspective, as you think about the longer-term ability to execute a budget, so now you're dropping down into more of a managerial space, what do line managers need from the portfolio management office to be able to successfully support projects as they are needing to be resourced or needing, whether those are human resources or whether they're investment-based resources. And then from a team member perspective, and typically team members don't have as much output needs from an informational perspective, but what do you want to be able to provide your team members as part of this planning process? As you go through your annual planning process, whether you incorporate improvements just annually as part of that process or whether you also do incremental improvements as part of reforecasting, be thoughtful and planful as how you want to implement those, and make sure that you put in place whatever tools and data gathering techniques that you want well in advance so that you can give your organization time to get educated on them, work any kinks out. Typically what I've done is, at the conclusion of one annual planning process, we will sit down and work back with the various key stakeholder groups and figure out, what really worked and what didn't. Carve those out as lessons learned, and then as we're preparing for the next planning process, because typically, a project portfolio is never a stagnant thing. You always have things that creep in throughout the year. Use those reforecasting cycles as your test bed to make improvements to your tools or processes. And that way, by the time you get to annual planning where things are a little bit constrained, everybody's under a crunch, they're also trying to drive other projects and things that they're doing in the organization. You've got tried and true and tested methods to gather your data. It's also important to be clear around, what you expect out of people and when, and to make sure that you build in the appropriate cycle times into your process so that the receiving, organizations of this data, your finance organization and so forth, have time to do their processing and then spit the information back to the organization if adjustments have to be made. So as you're putting together your annual planning calendar, it's important to make sure that you pull in those other stakeholder groups that may not, always be a part of, reforecasting or may not have as, big a footprint in it, to make sure that you accommodate for, their needs and wants from a timing perspective. So some things on screening, and this is more from a portfolio perspective, and we're going to talk about it both from what you want to be doing and then who participates in it. And whether you're looking at this from a product development or project management viewpoint, the process is pretty much the same, and you think of it, typically a project is there to develop a unique product or service. And so as you're looking at the strategy component of your business, again, that strategy should be reviewed to determine where you're at and define that current state. You'll want to then, based on department or division or however you're structured, pull together what it is that you want to accomplish next year or the following year to drive out those ideas. You then get to sort of a formulating step where you're putting together the business case and the rationale and the justification. Typically what a lot of organizations do is you know for a fact that there are going to be certain projects that you're going to have to do that may not return a great business value. Maybe there are things in the regulatory space where you are in a heavily regulated environment, and typically answering those regulatory concerns does not provide you with a lot of value back to your organization, whether it's through ROI or IRR or some of those other financial measures. Yet you're going to have them, and so what a lot of organizations will do is they'll set aside a certain percentage of their portfolio to address those concerns, and then should something crop up mid-cycle where you need to make adjustments, and that's where your normal portfolio selection and deselection processes would kick into place. The other thing that some organizations do is again, you may have certain infrastructure or end-of-life type projects that you need to take on where you may have software or hardware that's reaching end of life, and that those assets will need to be replaced or upgraded. Again, typically that doesn't return a great deal of value to the organization unless you are possibly a non-ERP related shop and you're going to head down the ERP path. So how much of your portfolio might you set aside to address those concerns? And so these are the type of discussions that typically would happen at that C-level or the next level down, where you want to sort of segment out, how much are you going to put from a total spend perspective on those infrastructure or wellness type initiatives. What are you going to set aside for regulatory? And then what's really going to be what I would call your change or innovate the business or your strategic projects. You'll then want to come up with methods to evaluate and score the ideas that come in for projects. And again, to the degree that you can be consistent in this process and keep the scoring criteria at least consistent, period over period or year to year, it's really helpful. If you have to go through rescoring exercises in mid-cycle where maybe you change the criteria or you change the thresholds of the criteria for scoring in mid-cycle, it can sometimes cause the organization to spin and churn, and you end up making greater investments in those reforecasting efforts because you've put in new scoring practices. Whereas if you can get new scoring practices implemented prior to when you have a number of projects getting ready to initiate or prior to a planning, a major annual planning cycle, it tends not to be as disruptive. And then once you've got your portfolio defined, it goes. You then get into basically the project delivery component, and how are you going to deliver these? Who's going to be assigned? What sponsors do you need to rally around the cause? Getting your project managers assigned and getting your teams decked up. So a little bit about who participates in these processes. And you'll notice as you go along the continuum, you're typically starting to pull more people in, and you're broadening the influence across the organization. So as you're looking to define your strategies and capture those ideas, typically that happens at a senior level of the organization. You may have department heads and people providing ideas into your organization, and so they'll need to be educated on how your PMO accepts a proposal or a business case. A lot of organizations will align what they call an IT business manager function that basically straddles between the business and their IT organization if their portfolio management function sits in IT. And what that helps you do is you've got somebody that is specifically tied to marketing, or specifically tied to product development, or specifically tied to manufacturing. And that person should have some pretty solid functional knowledge in those areas, but what they can do is basically help the translation as these different departments want to take on different initiatives, and help them get those ideas decked up in a solid fashion. The other thing I've seen done in a number of organizations is they will get a core group of business analysts that will help in the proposal development process. Now, by aligning a business analyst, you're not getting into detailed requirements, but a really good business analyst will be able to provide a fair amount of context in being able to deck those proposals up from a high-level business needs and features perspective, and also based on their experience should be able to provide some solid background and aiding with estimates. As you get into the evaluation portion, and typically this happens before you deck your ideas up to your selection committee, but the other group that you'll want to start pulling in is your architecture team if these are technology-related issues. If they're business-only related issues, a lot of organizations also have business architects. And what these folks do is assess feasibility, they assess strategic fit, they make sure that the initiatives that you're taking on fit in a longer-term technology or process strategy. And what that enables you to do is go to that portfolio selection committee with a well-thought-out and planned-out list of items to discuss and work through selection or deselection. Then once you get those ideas defined and selected, that's where you start engaging your project managers, your business analysts to start getting into the true requirements gathering process. You deck up your project teams, and then your portfolio management committee stays involved somewhat throughout, but typically you're pulling those folks back in through some sort of phase gating process, or based on criteria that would cause a project to fall out of favor and go from possibly a green state to an amber or red state, where you may need to make decisions on killing a project. The other place where these folks come into play is if all of a sudden a major regulatory concern comes up and you're going to have to shift your funding allocations from one bucket to another. While you may not necessarily kill some projects, you may make the decision to put some projects on hold for a period of time so that you can accommodate those new demands on your organization. It's really important to outline who's responsible for what and to clearly define the roles and responsibilities and how they play in the process. So your C-level folks, your head marketing person, your senior VP of sales, etc., they will all be working together to establish that strategy and that 3 to 5 year plan. They will get input from senior leaders and other key SMEs throughout the organization to help define those capabilities. Often the capabilities are specifically owned either at an SVP or department head level, and those people are going to end up owning the end process or product that's going to come out of a project, and so they've got a vested interest in how those items are decked up for approval. Your IT business managers, again, those are the folks that liaise between IT and the business. They can be a major benefit in the process. They can help you with your tooling. Oftentimes they're the ones that are going to be using the tooling that you use to collect this budgetary information, so the degree that you can get them up to speed and chain the process, it'll make it a lot easier. And then again, we talked about pulling in some business analysts to help put additional context around those ideas as you're getting them prepared for the budgeting process. The other thing to remember is just because someone decks up an idea and maybe it doesn't make it for the 2014 planning year, it doesn't necessarily mean that it won't make it in a future year. And so to the degree that you can keep a database or repository of things that were have been decked up over the years and maybe didn't fly, it does a couple things for your organization. One, you've got that running list, and has project Orion been decked up more than once, and if it has, why doesn't it make the cut? The other thing it does is it provides you some tangible examples around business case development and proposal development that you can use to help train your team members as well as refine your process. A little bit more about roles and responsibilities. Again, you'll want either that business or technical architect to weigh in on feasibility and fit. Your PMO ultimately champions the process. They're also the ones that aggregate the data. The more mature PMOs will also actually develop recommendations and share that portfolio management committee. So to the degree that you can go in and not basically give them a blank slate, but give them some scenarios or options, it often makes those conversations a lot easier. Plus, typically, your C-level executives, they're already in a boatload of meetings, and to basically walk into a meeting where they have a blank slate, that normally doesn't make them very happy. So it's important to come up with, a solid, workable agenda for that meeting or those discussions, so that you can keep everybody engaged and get the decisions out of that time with them that you need. Pulling in your financial rep, those people can help validate estimates. They can provide guidance on capital planning approaches and treatments. They can also aid in your financial development processes and how you handle the variety of financial inputs and outputs that a portfolio management department has to deal with. So again, how are you going to deal with accruals? How are you going to handle capitalization? Where do project managers have to be well-skilled in certain financial treatments? You may have the benefit of having project controllers, and those folks may have a stronger play in the financial management of your projects. If you don't have a PPM system, you may be working on spreadsheets, and so to what degree can the finance folks help you with pulling together those spreadsheets where you're not having to do a lot of cut, copy, and paste, but you can do macro-based spreadsheets that will start to aggregate the data. If you do have a PPM system, then what you want to be able to do is provide the right role, again, whether it's a project manager, an IT business partner, a controller, with the guidelines and tools that they need to make sure that the data gets into the system in such a way that, on the back end you can see after selection, what that total portfolio budget looks like and what the run rates are. Your PMs are important in this because they're going to be executing the projects, and ultimately you're going to want to hold them accountable for some level of monitoring, controlling, as well as re-estimation planning. Whether they actually have the dollars and cents behind it, or whether they're just turning back in hours, and those hours are then computed on the back end through either finance or some other part of the organization. ultimately the PM's responsibility to make sure that they've got a well-thought-out plan that contains all the components that you would need to drive an estimate. Now, it's also important, for, as you get into the planning cycles of your projects, to make sure that PMs are not necessarily doing those plans in a vacuum, but they're leveraging some of the techniques to incorporate input from the SMEs for their schedules. So if you think about how the estimation process overlays with your planning process, typically when you get those big ideas and those proposals, there's going to be a plus or minus range associated with that, and it varies on organizations. Some organizations it's plus 25 minus 75 or plus 75 minus 25, and then as that idea matures and becomes a project, the range of variability on that estimate should continue to decrease, so that by the time you are really getting into the project size of things, most PMOs try to run with a plus or minus 5 or 10% on project plans. If you don't bring it down to that level, you're going to have a hard time controlling your project budgets. As well as you'll want to put in a way where if you have a project wrap up in July and they came in under budget, so now you've got spending authority in your portfolio, how does that spending authority get allocated back out or held if needed? Some things to keep in mind as you get into your estimating and your business case components. You'll want to account for your tangible costs and benefits. Benefits is tough for organizations, and that's a maturity aspect. So if you're new in the PMO space or if your PMO is relatively new, while I think capturing benefits is an important part of your planning process, I would probably recommend or suggest that don't expect a high degree of maturity in this space in the early years. It's going to take a while for your organization to mature. It's also going to take a while to get the right governance in place to hold people accountable. So a great starting place is just having folks try to define what are the various benefits that they think that they're going to get out of a given initiative, and are they tangible or intangible. And then from there, maybe being able to put some thresholds on them, but not necessarily holding them down to a very specific dollar amount. And then as your organization matures, continue to kind of tighten down those controls around those folks. The other thing to remember when you get into benefits management, and we'll be doing a webinar on this towards the end of the year, is the owner of the benefits is not the project manager. The owner of the benefits it's not the project team. The owner of the benefits is the sponsor and the sponsoring organization. The project manager and the project team help them get there, but ultimately, the PM is going to go away at some point and probably move on to another project. The project team is going to disband, and they're going to go on to other work as well. So it's your sponsoring organization that's ultimately accountable for those benefits. The other thing to pull into those business case components are your intangible benefits, direct costs, and so forth. Oftentimes, there are some pretty robust discussions that come around sunk costs when making the decision to do projects, and to what degree do you include those sunk costs. Unless you really can tie an initiative to the project, so maybe you brought in a consulting firm to do a bunch of market-based pre-work and so forth that really drove a decision around this is why we're going to do project X. In those instances, it may make sense to tie those sunk costs in from a business case perspective. For the most part, typically if organizations are bringing in assistance, or if they're going to go do studies on some capability that they want to drive, that's typically accounted for in other places within your budget. So you're estimating business practices and measures, typically the components that are pulled into that preliminary view of that great idea where somebody wants to initiate a project, you'll want to look at some financial measures such as return on investment, IRR, NPV. A lot of organizations, try to capture, are there cost savings to the organization? Is there cost avoidance? Are we mitigating risk? Is this a compliance or regulatory concern? Will this provide us some level of competitive differentiation in the marketplace? Is this part of our corporate innovation strategy? Does it enable us to be a more agile organization so we can respond more quickly in the marketplace? And then to what degree is there strategic alignment? So that process for drawing the line and making the cut, typically when you go into the budget process, you'll have some level of an idea of how much funding you're going to have in a given year from a portfolio spend perspective. And oftentimes, that dollar, that magical dollar value will come down from the top, and it'll be driven off of a couple of things. It'll be driven off of previous run rates, and so how much money has your portfolio had in the past. Of course, the economic factors of the business will be taken into it, where you are in your strategic plan, and are there major strategic things that the organization needs to kick off in order to meet that plan. Those all go into the magic number that you get to spend and run your portfolio with. And then from there, the process is you're using that proposal process or that intake process to gather that initial list of projects and gather the data around the ability to evaluate those projects. You're applying those hurdles, and so whether they're cost measures or strategic measures or whatever you're going to assess those projects against, to the degree that you can actually evaluate and rank those projects in a linear fashion. So if you get 100 ideas, be able to rank them 1 through 100. Don't try to have a cluster of them, sitting in the top 30 or 40, because it's going to be really tough for you to draw that cut line. You then apply a cut line. And so if you ended up with 100 initiatives that came in that are costing your organization $500 million, and you have $130 million to spend, well, you draw the cut line at $130 million. And that pretty quickly demonstrates where things fall off and what made it. And from there, then, it's up to that portfolio selection committee to really discuss. And in some instances, they may make the decision to defer certain criteria that they initially determined were going to be applied against those ideas. It's important that you try to capture those discussions and decisions for them, and you don't necessarily need to get down to, Charles said this and Sandra said that. But if projects get moved above and beyond the cut line where they make decisions to forego certain criteria, you'll just want to document that. So if at some point in time somebody comes back and says, well, I don't understand why this project got there, you've got the context behind it. The other thing to remember is that, as much as we would love to have this process be a one-and-done kind of deal where you do it once a year and then you get to walk away and kind of do other things for 9 months before you come back, it is iterative because you're going to revisit this probably to a lesser degree during your forecasting cycles. And then the other component that you have to take into consideration are when new initiatives that come out of the blue that weren't planned for that the organization has to react to. The other thing that always hits PMOs too, or when your existing initiatives tend to creep. And there's that whole line of dependencies, and I always kind of liken it to, you're an air traffic controller. And if you're expecting a certain plane to land before another plane can take off, and that plane ends up circling the airport for a couple months because you can't get the darn thing to land, what's going to happen is it's going to delay the other plane from taking off. Now, there are things that you can do to minimize that delay, whether it's bring in additional resources, or shift things around. But as the portfolio manager, that's part of that cyclical process that you're basically battling on an ongoing basis. And so, it's important that you, put in those phase gate processes to be monitoring, your existing project health and to be shepherding those along. You've got solid benefit and estimation processes in place. Your project managers understand to what level they need to decompose their project plans so that not only that they can manage to them, but that you can get valuable information from them from a financial perspective. And then your resource management processes, and as we talked about earlier in the year, this is another tough set of processes that typically take a lot of input from a lot of different people. But the inputs and outputs from your resource and capacity planning are an integral part to all of this. So I mentioned briefly that where finance plays a big role in this, and if you don't have a financial buddy in your finance department that you can cozy up to the degree that you can find somebody, or work back with that CFO and make a request to get somebody that is aligned to your portfolio organization, it could be of great benefit. That person can help you and your team define what policies and standards do you need to align to. Do your project managers need to be really astute in capitalization and depreciation, or will finance take care of that for them based on certain schedules and things that they turn over to finance? Do your project managers have to accommodate an accrual process that runs on a regular basis in your organization, or again, will finance account for that based on data that comes in? These are all things that not only impact your annual planning process, but also will impact those reforecasting processes on a regular basis. And the other thing to remember with your finance person is, as you get into the actual execution of your portfolio and you're entertaining changes within your portfolio, it's always good to have that financial liaison vet some of those changes from a financial perspective. It'll help you as a portfolio manager. If you're not really astute in the financial discipline, you'll become really astute in the financial discipline, so you're going to be able to grow your skills. It's also going to add some credibility to your portfolio organization. So we've talked about how to structure your portfolio, and again, some organizations will have programs. Some will manage with projects only. Some will manage in a composite fashion. To the degree that you can ultimately roll this up into one defined list, that's great. Whether you have discrete portfolios based on business unit or based on strategic alignment. Pretty much how you slice and dice the work is up to you and the needs of your organization, but ideally you do want the organization working off of one comprehensive list from a planning perspective. And then some things to keep in mind from a best practices perspective. To the degree that you cycle through this, both from a quarterly perspective and year to year, what you want to try to do is make your improvements focused in such where you reduce the time that is required from your project managers, your resource managers, your department managers, so that they can focus on really driving organizational change for your organization. You want to try to keep the number of iterations down to a minimum, yet maximize the quality component. So rather than having to go through a budget cycle, multiple times, work to get that, first portfolio or first list of projects, decked up and draw the line so that people can see, and then if people need to go back and sharpen their pencils, they can do it again. But try not to have the landscape continuously changing or have so many reviews that people don't have time to get their work done. When it comes to budgeting, you want to focus, on material items, and to the degree possible, leverage run rates and baselines for the operational side of your business. So, if your IT department headcount or your marketing department headcount or whatever is remaining the same, then you would account for a certain amount of raises in that department, and you should be able to, again, budget for that on a run rate perspective versus, getting down to, the head or the paperclip. You also want to, you want to keep the level of detail such where you can do the proper analysis, but you don't want to get it so detailed where rolling the costs up make the analysis cumbersome. You want to have performance improvement be a byproduct of your budget process. So, very rarely is a process perfect, and so to the degree that you can always focus on how can we improve things and make things better for the next go-around, and make sure that you provide adequate timing for that on an annual basis. And then ideally you want your strategic planning process as it relates to your strategic projects to be aligned back to that strategic plan, so that you know that you're making the right, you're supporting the organization and making the right investment decisions for their resources.